Hello friends, welcome back. Today I will continue my discussion pertaining to reinforcement. In our last session, I talked about shaping behavior especially through reinforcement, and we ended up our discussion with the types of reinforcement, that is continuous and intermittent or partial reinforcement. Let us now discuss about the same topic in detail in this session, that what is continuous reinforcement. Reinforcing a desired behavior each time it is demonstrated or performed is called continuous reinforcement. So, it is very effective in motivating a desirable behavior, especially in the early stages of learning, and when reinforcement is withdrawn, however, extension sets in very quickly. Every time in the learning process the response is reinforced, the response becomes strengthened, that is but obvious. In long run, whenever the employees are undergoing any training program and the training is tough, after every training the employees are being reinforced, they are being rewarded for performing any specific skill, task or expertise. This encourages them to perform more or better, and at the same time they also get the understanding of any particular behavior to be considered as desirable, as it is rewarded every time it is being demonstrated. But in the long run, if the well learned task is not reinforced every time it is performed, maybe the employee or the subject is not reinforced in that manner, and definitely that leads to extension of that response that has to be performed, because there is no link between reinforcement and demonstrating a particular or desirable behavior. As soon as the reward system in performing the behavior is not in parallel with the desirable behavior, then ultimately the desirable behavior tends to extinct. That means, the tendency or frequency of performing the desirable behavior goes down or it decreases. So, extension is decreasing the frequency of behavior by eliminating a reward or desirable consequence that follows that behavior. So, that is why it is being said that every time a desirable behavior is performed or demonstrated, it should be reinforced. But there are certain factors, situations that play in the background, that maybe every time the desirable behavior is not performed, and in long run this leads to extension of that behavior. However, reinforcement, that is continuous reinforcement, has its own drawbacks, and the major drawback is that it has serious difficulty for the manager, because every time the manager has to monitor the response or the behavior of the employees and provide effective reinforcement. So, that is why sometimes if the manager lacks in monitoring the response regularly and it is not reinforced, this also leads to extension of that desirable behavior. The most important aspect of continuous reinforcement is that it poses difficulty for the manager to monitor every response or every desirable behavior. Whereas, what is intermittent reinforcement? When every instance the behavior is performed is not reinforced, often it is being reinforced and it is worth repeating. So, whenever an employee is performing a task, maybe every task is not reinforced, although every task is desirable, but maybe some behaviors are being reinforced while others are not. This is called intermittent reinforcement or partial reinforcement. Maybe employees are undergoing the training, and as soon as they finish the training, they complete their training and they are performing their task, maybe after 2 or 3 months or maybe after 2 or 3 instances, that behavior or expertise of the employee is being reinforced or rewarded. This is intermittent reinforcement. So, intermittent reinforcement can be of two types, ratio or interval type. Ratio schedules depend on how many responses the subject makes. So, the individual is reinforced after giving a certain number of specific response. For example, any assembly line worker will be reinforced only when he tries to manufacture maybe 50 or 100 units in an hour. So, this is ratio schedule. It is how many responses the subject makes. The individual is reinforced after giving a certain number of specific responses. Whereas, interval schedules depend on how much time has passed since the previous reinforcement. So, it is the time factor that plays in interview schedules. With interview schedules, the individual is reinforced on the appropriate behavior or response after a particular time has elapsed. For example, if we go back to the conditioning experiment by Ivan Pavlov, that after the bell has rung after 5 minutes or 10 minutes only the food is presented before the dog. So, how much time has to be there for the response and the reward, that is interval schedules. Now, this presentation of food after every bell can vary, maybe initially it was 3 seconds, then it is 5 seconds, then it was 1 minute or maybe 5 minutes. So, this is interview schedules. These are the two kinds of intermittent reinforcement, that is ratio schedules and interview schedules. Also, when we are talking about intermittent reinforcement based on ratio or interval schedules, these schedules can also be classified as fixed or variable. This is classification of intermittent reinforcement. They are of two types, ratio schedules and interview schedules. Ratio schedules are again classified into two types, fixed ratio and variable ratio, and variable schedules are divided into two forms, that is fixed interval and variable interval. So, what are fixed interval schedules? No reinforcement, no matter how many times a response is made until a certain interval of time, a minute or so has elapsed. For example, our monthly paycheck or a weekly paycheck, any employee who is performing his job will only get his reinforcement or reward in form of his paycheck at the end of the month. So, this is fixed interval schedule, that is after every 30 days, that is when the month is over, the employee will receive his paycheck. This is fixed interval schedule. There is no alteration, maybe earlier or later. There is fixed time that in this much of time only the reward will be presented to the employee. So, this is fixed interval schedule. This pattern of reinforcement in this type of schedule consists of a gradual acceleration of responding during the interval to produce the desired response. So, whatever the task has been performed or has been assigned to the employee, he will perform that task accordingly until and unless those 30 days have elapsed. So, the reinforcement schedule is a fixed interval schedule when rewards are spaced at uniform time intervals. So, every employee will receive his paycheck after 30 days of his performance. In during that time, it depends on an individual's desirability that how much time he has to pay to his job or devote to his job, because the task has been assigned. Either he can use all the 30 days or he can use only 15 days to complete his task. So, the critical variable is time, which is held constant. So, what is the constant here is 30 days, that is the time is constant no matter what. When 30 days will elapse, then only the paycheck will be received by the employee. So, this is a fixed interval schedule. The other is variable interval schedule, a schedule of reinforcement in which a variable amount of time must elapse before a response will yield a reinforcement. For example, as I gave just now only, that in Pavlov's experiment, that delivering a food pellet to a rat after the first bar presses, following a 1 minute interval, after 2 minutes, 5 minutes and so on. So, whenever the bell has rung and the time has elapsed maybe of 1 minute or 2 minutes or maybe 5 seconds or 10 seconds and 20 seconds, then only the food will be presented to the dog. That means, this interval schedule is varying from minute to minute. Maybe initially the response in the reward appeared was presented to the dog after 3 seconds. Maybe the next reward will be presented to the dog after 1 minute or 5 minutes and so on. So, the time is not constant like that of fixed interval schedule. It is varying from minute to minute. Initially it was 1 minute, then it was 2 minutes, then it was 5 minutes or maybe 6 minutes. So, this is variable interval schedule. The next is fixed ratio schedule. This reinforcement occurs only after a fixed number of responses. Generally, such schedule yield a high rate response. This type of schedule generates a pattern in which there is a pause in responding after each reinforced response and a rapid run of responses until the next reinforced response. For example, that maybe the employees have the task to produce maybe 120 units or 100 units per minute or per hour, and this much will be the reward. Now, as soon as they understand that it depends on that the faster they will manufacture, the more they will earn. So, they are also reinforced to enhance their performance accordingly. For example, the employee receives a reward based on the number of work pieces generated. If the piece rate of a zipper installer in a dressmaking factory is Indian rupees is 120 per dozen, the reinforcement is fixed to the number of zippers sewn into garments. After every dozen is sewn, the installer has earned another INR 120. So, it is up to the employee's capacity to perform the desirable task, that how many times in a day he will produce after every dozen, he will receive the reward after every manufacturing of the unit. Maybe it is 1 dozen, 120, maybe he produces 12 dozens of the units. So, it will be into 120 into 12. So, this is how it is fixed ratio. Accordingly, how much you perform, the reward is in ratio to your performance. So, the more the performance, the more is the ratio. This is fixed ratio schedule. The other is variable ratio schedule, a schedule of reinforcement in which reinforcement is delivered after a variable number of responses have been made. For example, any salesman who on some occasions they make a sale after only 2 calls to a potential customer, on other occasions they might need to make 20 or more calls to secure a sale. So, it depends on an individual's capacity or employee's capacity to convince the customer to sell the product, maybe after making only 2 calls. So, he will get the reward, or maybe the salesperson will be making 20 or more so calls just to sell one product. So, it is an individual's capacity that he is selling the product after making every 2 calls and then selling the product, or he is taking lot of time to make 20 calls and then receive the reward. So, this is variable ratio schedule. So, after how many calls the employee or the salesman is able to sell the product, that depends on an individual's capacity. So, the more is the capacity, that is after every 2 calls you are selling a product, or maybe after 3 calls you are selling a product, more will be the reward, more will be the profit for the salesman. This is about interview schedules. But the point is that in every schedule, whether it is ratio or interval, whether it is fixed or variable, only the desirable response is rewarded in order to strengthen the performance. Now, when the reward is there, an employee's capacity or expertise is also there. So, it is an individual's discretion that to what extent he or she can use his capacity or expertise to perform better and better. It is not that the organization will not reinforce, it is an individual's discretion and capacity how to respond in terms of his performance to gain more rewards or consequences. This is the summary schedule of reinforcement, where in continuous reinforcement reward is given after every response or desirable behavior, and the effect is that there is fast learning of new behavior, but rapid extension. Why? The subject is learning faster and faster, but as soon as the reward is being withdrawn from the performance, then immediately it leads to demotivation of the employee, and they also start to forget that desirable response. So, this leads to extension. Fixed interval, reward is given at a fixed interval time, for example, weekly or monthly paycheck. Average and irregular performance with rapid extension. That means, even if they have the expertise, they will not perform up to that level, because they know that they will ultimately get the reward only after 30 days have passed. Variable interval, reward given at variable time intervals. Moderately high and stable performance is the effect of behavior with slow extension. For example, pop quizzes. Every time the question is coming and every time it is not right, the response is not correct. So, every time the response is correct, then only the response is rewarded. So, this is about that subject will try to improve his or her performance, and at the same time he will be more stabilized in his performance to give a desirable response. And it also leads to slow extension. Maybe there can be a chance when any subject is participating in any quiz that maybe initially 4 or 5 responses went wrong, and it can lead to extension. The other is fixed ratio, reward given at fixed amount of output. High and stable performance attained quickly, but also with rapid extension. Again, how much units you produce in 1 hour, it is up to an individual's performance. So, this is about fixed ratio, that is piece rate pay. So, but it also leads to rapid extension, because maybe one employee is able to perform maximum and maybe the other employee would not be able to perform or manufacture maximum units in 1 hour, and he is demotivated and leads to extension of that response. And the other is variable ratio, again rewards given at variable amounts of output, then performance is very high with slow extension, such as commission sales, as we have discussed this example, that ultimately the employee is more responsible or accountable for his performance. So, there is slow extension because he is performing his task as per the customer he or she is received. So, his performance is the desired behavior is contingent on the customers the salesperson receives. So, this is a summary schedule of reinforcement where every time the desirable response is rewarded, and most of the time if not rewarded accordingly, it also leads to extension of the desirable behavior. Alright, reinforcement schedules and behavior, to what extent they are useful or applicable in different situations. So, continuous reinforcement schedules can lead to early satiation, and under this schedule behavior tends to weaken rapidly when reinforcers are withheld. For example, maybe in the training process every response is being reinforced. There will be a stage where the behavior becomes stable, because the objective is that the training should be imparted, complete training should be imparted to the employees. As soon as it is being learned that the training is complete and it is imparted to the employees as participants, the behavior is not being reinforced. This leads to extension of the response because the reward is not presented for their performance, and the employees as participants also tend to lose interest in performing a desirable response. However, continuous reinforcers are appropriate for newly emitted unstable or low frequency responses. This is more effective when new behavior has to be learned or undesirable behaviors have to weakened, emitted, and more desirable behavior has to be made stable. This is more applicable in that situation where situation and learning and the participants are new and they require the particular behavior to become more stable. In contrast, intermittent reinforcers preclude early satiation because they do not follow every response. They are appropriate for stable or high frequency response. So, this is only effective when the task is well learned and the subject also do not desire much for the reward because they more focus on the expertise rather than the rewards. But yes, definitely if any response which is newly learned by the participant or the subject or the employees, if they are not being rewarded regularly at regular intervals, then it leads to extension or satiation. Satiation here means that they are not much interested to perform because they know that the reinforcement will not come to them. So, this is the drawbacks and advantages of reinforcement schedules and behavior, that how reinforcement has its impact on behavior in long run, that to what extent reinforcement will help an employee to sustain as behavior, that is the desirable behavior, and to what extent reinforcement process will tend to weaken the inappropriate or undesirable behavior. Further, variable schedules tend to lead to high performance than fixed schedules. For example, as noted previously, most employees in organizations are paid on fixed interval schedules such as their weekly or monthly paychecks. The reward is given from time spent on the job rather than for a specific response. No matter how much expertise an employee has, that does not matter at all with that particular expertise what kind of work he has done. It is only that he can only be rewarded once the month is over and paycheck is being presented to the participant or the employee. Whereas, in variable interval schedules, it generates high rates of responses and more stable and consistent behavior because there is a high correlation between performance and reward, and because of the uncertainty involved, the employee tends to be more alert because there is a surprise factor. As we go back to the example of the dog and the bell and the food, the dog is alert because he is not aware that in what time he will receive the reinforcement or the reward. So, he is alert that he has to perform well at every instance, because although the dog also knows that every time the reward will not come, but what if the reward will come, it will act as a surprise factor or as a motivating factor to perform better in the next response as well. So, this is the difference between variable schedule and variable interval schedules in terms of impact on behavior, that is desirable behavior that has to be performed. This is just a pictorial representation of the intermittent schedules and reinforcement. For instance, if we go to the first one, fixed interval schedules, employees receipt of a weekly paycheck. So, maybe everybody is receiving a paycheck after 1 week, 2 week, 3 week or maybe 15 weeks. Variable interval schedules, pop quizzes in a classroom, that maybe second response was the correct response, so there is a reward. Maybe the fourth response is the correct response, so it is rewarded. 8th and 9th and 12th responses were correct, so they were rewarded. Fixed ratio schedules, that any person, any employee who is producing maybe 12 unit, 24 unit, 36 units, that means every 12 units are being performed or produced, then only the reinforcement will be there. For example, the zippers installed, that how many dozens an employee can manufacture, the more will be the reward. And the last is variable ratio schedules, that is commissioned salespeople. Again, maybe in the first 3 calls the salesman could sell the product and reinforcement is there. Sometimes maybe after 7 calls or the 6 calls, the reinforcement coming in the 7th call or in the 8th or 9th. So, it depends on the ratio, variable ratio, that every time there is a call, customer is being satisfied to sell the product and then only a reinforcement is there, reinforcement in form of commission. So, how much units you are selling to the customer based on the phone calls, the salesman will receive the commission. So, this is how intermittent schedules and reinforcement is being decided by every organization. It has its own applicability in terms of learning. Learning here means omission, that is how to eliminate or emit undesirable behaviors and foster appropriate behaviors in form of training and learning and development. So, this is about continuous and reinforcement schedules, where we have discussed about what is the difference between continuous and intermittent reinforcement, then types of intermittent reinforcement, that is ratio schedules, interval schedules, fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval and variable interval, right, and how it impacts human behavior in terms of appropriate and inappropriate behavioral aspects. So, we will continue with the discussion in the next session. Thank you so much.